Yep, you're all good, Erica.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to get started and get the intros out of the way so that we can get into the discussion. My name is Erica Barnett. I'm your moderator today. I'm the co-founder and editor of Publicola, a Seattle-based news and politics website. And we've been covering state and local news and politics since 2009. Today's Transit Talk is hosted by Transportation Choices Coalition, a policy and advocacy organization in Washington State that works to bring people more and better transportation options that are healthy, sustainable, and accessible. Transportation Choices Coalition would like to take a moment and acknowledge that while we are gathering today virtually, our panel is joining us from unceded lands in the Pacific Northwest. We are calling in from the tribal land of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish, Suquamish, Snohomish, and Muckleshoot people. We are dropping a resource in the chat, and we invite you to learn about the land you are on, and we welcome you to acknowledge it in the chat. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started about our virtual space. We have enabled captions for this event. If you would like to show or hide the subtitles in the main room, you can do so using the buttons at the bottom of your Zoom screen under live transcript. And please use the chat to ask questions and expand on discussion topics. Of course, please be respectful to panelists and each other. You can also send questions in the chat or privately to McKenna Lux. And this webinar will be recorded and shared with you once it is available. And I would now like to introduce our incredible panel of speakers today. We are joined by Alex Hudson, Executive Director at Transportation Choices Coalition, Bryce Yaden, lobbyist at TCC, Transportation Choices, Senator Marco Elias, who represents Washington's 21st legislative district in the Everett area. And Senator Elias is also chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. And finally, we have Senator Javier Valdez, who represents Washington's 46th legislative district in North King County. So we are going to kick things off with some questions for the entire panel about jaywalking. Transportation Choices and the Free to Walk Washington Coalition are looking to end laws that punish people for being in the roadway. So our first question, we'll start with Senator Valdez. Why is it important to eliminate laws against jaywalking?
Thank you, Erica, and thanks for Transportation Choices for inviting me here today. And it's great to be here. Well, I mean, I know that I think the data has shown and suggests that folks who are usually ticketed for jaywalking tend to be folks from our underserved communities or communities of color, where there's definitely been the data would suggest that when folks are targeting for jaywalking, it is a disproportionate of, again, our underserved communities and their residents who are hit hardest by this. I guess I come from the perspective also is that, we know that there's, with current law enforcement, they are strained as it is right now. And it just seems also for me is that, there's just other more important things that they, it's a common phrase that they could be focusing on, rather than if someone is, looking both ways and there's no cars coming and they're safely, of course, not, putting anybody in danger, any car or anybody else in danger, that, law enforcement can just be, looking at something else to focus on. And it's for me, jaywalking is not the highest priority, unless, of course, I mean, they should only be really, getting involved if there's someone, of course, who is, either putting traffic in danger or cars in danger or other people in danger. But that's kind of my perspective. And again, but the data usually suggests, at least that's been shown to me, is that, again, it affects primarily, people of color disproportionately and those neighborhoods as well.
Senator Elias, same question, and if you can talk a little bit about how this might play out in the upcoming session.
Yeah, it's been a dream of mine to be on a Publicola hosted event, so I'm glad that we finally
glad we can make it happen.
That. Yeah, it's a joy to be with you, and of course, Alex Hudson and Bryce are wonderful humans, and Senator Valdez, we're excited to have him join the committee and our Senate Democratic Caucus. I sort of begin at the outset with, like, what are our expectations of one another in the transportation system? And I feel like what we should do is set fair and equitable expectations for everybody that uses the transportation system. And when we single out one mode, I always want to sort of ask why. Like, why are we treating people who are walking or rolling differently than other users? And last session, we actually clarified the law regarding pedestrians and made it clear that pedestrians, just like everybody else, have a duty of care when they're in the right of way, which means they have to behave responsibly and yield appropriately to the other users of the transportation system. So we kind of have set out already what's our expectation, just like auto drivers, just like bus drivers, just like other users. We want our pedestrians to be aware of their surroundings, as Senator Valdez said, and to behave appropriately. So now that that's the expectation in the law, I don't think we need a specific violation for jaywalking, because our law enforcement folks, if they see someone that's violating that duty of care, just like if they see any other user, they already have tools to hold that person accountable. So we don't need this specific one. And then when you look at the history of how these laws were used, it's clear that there's been disproportionate enforcement against low-income and BIPOC communities. And I think we're trying to move as a state away from a place where we use traffic laws to punitively address, certain communities. I did see a comment in chat about highways. There are also specific requirements about who can be in a highway or a limited access facility. So this wouldn't speak to that. This is sort of in your neighborhood streets. If there's a pedestrian that is not behaving according to the norms, there's already tools to deal with that. We don't need this particular law that's been used disproportionately. That's my opinion. Now, this is a new topic. We need to educate our lawmakers in the legislature about, like, what's the difference between duty of care and jaywalking, and clarify sort of what the best way is to enforce the law moving forward. And I think that maybe we can get that done this session. Sometimes that kind of culture change takes a little while.
Same question for you, Bryce. Why is it important to eliminate these laws?
Yeah, I think both previous speakers, both senators have kind of mentioned it, but a couple of things I did want to bring out in terms of additional data is just, kind of pointing to a 2017 Seattle Times article that found that about a quarter of the tickets issued for jaywalking went to Black people, and they represent 7% of the population in Seattle. So, both Senator Valdez and Senator Leas have alluded to that, but really bringing that forward and showing that that's one of the reasons. The second one I think that we like to talk about and think through is, at the end of the day, we have certain infrastructure deficiencies that I think we're working towards, that we started working to fix last year with the significant investments in transit and bike ped facilities. And we also know that infrastructure is extremely limited in some neighborhoods, while might be more robust for pedestrians and others. So, where some of these occurrences happen might be because of a lack of infrastructure, as opposed to actually actively trying to break a law. So when we talk about why it's important, is really to look at how both our infrastructure plays a role into it, how we enforce our laws, and what the outcomes we're seeking. And at the end of the day, I think all of our goals are to make sure that we have a safe roadway usage, safe roads, safe streets for everybody to use, and making sure, as Senator Leas said, we're really using that duty of care. And that's something that's now inherent across all modes for transportation, and just elevating that. We don't need additional restrictions, because those restrictions aren't necessarily keeping anybody safe at the end of the day.
And Alex, did you have anything to add? It's hard reading from last.
I'll do my best. I mean, yeah, TCC, our perspective is that these jaywalking laws are unhelpful, outdated, and oppressive. And it's time to take a look at the thing that I would add to everything that has been said here is that a reminder to folks that these laws are about 100 years old. They first started in kind of the late 10s of the 1900s. And this legislation was originally written by the automobile companies. These legislations really, and then it kind of started sweeping the nation, became really the sort of the first shot across the bow of the establishment of auto dominant culture in the United States. Because prior to these laws, people were free to use the streets and the sidewalks using a good duty of care however they wanted. And so both the term itself, J is a slur that is meant to disparage people who weren't considered to be cosmopolitan or urban, and to suggest that, that only a person like that would cross the street. And so it was both a negative stereotype of pedestrians, but also really the beginning of the establishment of the auto-dominated and auto-centric kind of culture and set of laws that we have here.
Can someone explain what the law would change? I mean, just kind of lay out what the bill actually looks like. We've got a comment in the Q&A about the duty of care and whether it puts an unreasonable burden on pedestrians to prove that they didn't violate the standard.
Yeah, so I'll give you a quick rundown of kind of the structure that we've been having conversations with Senator Saldana and others regarding is really removing just the direct requirement around enforcing crossing at non-marked intersections or at mid-block, making sure we're moving those. That's fundamentally what it does. And there's 3 or 4 different RCWs in addition to that reference some form of crossing against a light or other things. But none of those to the duty of care, none of them mention a duty of care. And as Senator Elias mentioned, that was updated last year. The duty of care is functionally, and I think Senator Elias and Senator Valdez might be able to expand on this a little bit more, but the duty of care is supposed to apply equally to all users. The definition applies to vehicles and pedestrians and bicyclists. It has the same definition and it's meant to be applied equally. So what we're trying to do is just remove some of the excess baggage that's out there that people use when they're not impeding or creating a safety issue, and saying if they're taking a duty of care and not causing any issues, there shouldn't be a problem with, again, crossing mid-block if your next crosswalk is a half a mile away, because that's what it's doing. And then, how duty of care is enforced. Obviously, I think that there's opportunity for it to be enforced disproportionately depending on specific views, but the intent of the legislation with duty of care is not meant that way. It's supposed to say, what are your impacts on the roadway and what are you doing to limit those, and have you taken the correct steps to prevent harm or injury to others is fundamentally what the goal is. So thinking about it that way is kind of why we want to remove those additional ones. Kind of goes back to, what we do for distracted driving versus some of the other things. Like, you used to not be able to have TVs in your cars, but we removed that because distracted driving kind of covers a lot more of it, and you use that. So we're just trying to make it so it's a little more, we're trying to make it so some of those laws that are enforced in an unequitable manner are removed, and there's more due diligence on those ends.
If anybody else wants to jump in on jaywalking, now's your time, or we're going to move on to another issue. So I'll pause for a second.
I would be remiss to not point people to our website, freetowalkwa.org, I think it is. Somebody will drop it in the chat, where there's a ton of information. We've got videos that talk about, I see in the chat here, interest in the history of these laws that kind of point to that talk about how this is part of a national movement away from, California just struck jaywalking from their code as well. Nevada, same thing. Kansas City, Virginia. So this is a pretty widely adopted idea, and you can check it out or have your organization join our coalition and endorse at the website, as well as if you yourself have been cited for jaywalking, we want to hear your story. So there's a place there where you can share with us your experience as well.
I do have a personal story to share if I could, because it's always remained with me. So one of my best friends from high school, he and I came over from, Moses Lake, where, straight out of Moses Lake, to attend the University of Washington, obviously many, many years ago. One of his first experiences coming into Seattle is when he took a Greyhound bus. to the downtown Greyhound station, which is at that time, of course, on Stewart Avenue. And his brother was waiting for him right across the street. And of course, when you're from a rural town, walking across the street is no big deal. He ran across the street to meet his brother, and he got a jaywalking ticket because there was a SPD officer there. So it's always remained with me when he told me that story many years ago. But it wasn't a good way to start his first time, his way journeying from Moses Lake to Seattle. And it's just again, it's just something. To me, it's always just reinforces that's just something that needs to change.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that this is part of why we've included a school-based bike program as part of Move Ahead. We want to teach young people in elementary school like how to interact in traffic as a bicyclist, as a pedestrian. The jaywalking law doesn't do anything about the underlying requirements of a pedestrian. If there's a sidewalk, you need to use it. If there isn't a sidewalk, the law talks about walking on the shoulder. If there isn't a shoulder, then you should walk on the edge of the road. The law already spells out, independent of this, like how we want people to behave. This doesn't change any of that. It just says you can't do targeted enforcement on this particular piece because we know that that's disproportionate. If someone's violating the underlying law and being an irresponsible pedestrian, and we love pedestrians, but occasionally someone walks under the influence or isn't following the law, there's going to be an ability for law enforcement to make sure everybody's safe. We just don't need this 100-year-old disproportionate version of it. So I think we need to sort of keep it in the broader context.
All right, well, Senator Valdez, I have a similar story from when I first moved to Seattle, but I was very shocked to learn that you had to pay money and pay a ticket for walking across the street. That was not the case in the city where I moved from, but it's good to hear that maybe that will be changing. So now we're going to move on to the issue of road usage charges. And Senator Valdez, I heard you call it a RUC, so I'm going to call it a RUC. Those are it's an innovative way to generate transportation revenue that charges people by the number of miles they drive, and eventually could be a substitute for the gas tax, which funds transportation on roads in our state. So the first question for Alex and Bryce is, can you tell us a little bit about what the RUC is and why it is so important?
So I'll just give some general background, and then I'll have Alex kind of explain why it's going to be really important in the coming years to TCC and the work we're doing. A road usage charge, as was just mentioned, is a pay by mile potential transportation tax, and it's really meant to raise revenue for the transportation system. It has been studied at the federal level and at the state level for a number of years, trying to figure out how to implement it. Those include, how do you collect the revenue for a road usage charge? It's different than say a pay at point that we do with the gas tax, or what we do with vehicle license fees or something else, where when you go to pick it up, you pay that tax at the same time. You kind of pay it after the fact, after you've driven miles, to indicate, how much your tax burden might be at the end of the day. And so it's really just another transportation revenue option as we look at the future of transportation revenue and what that could potentially look like. There's always a need for revenue as others either get spent down or other revenues are used and also spent down. We have added a lot of Climate Commitment Act dollars to things that will help reduce carbon emissions and increase safety. And eventually, the goal with some of those CCA dollars is that those would, if we're doing our carbon policies correctly, will go away. So we need to make sure that we have long-term revenues to replace those as well. We have long-term declining gas tax revenues as well. When you look at the out years, vehicles are becoming more fuel efficient. We have electric vehicles that don't pay a gas tax. So really what it fundamentally is just a long-term replacement for all transportation funding as we look forward to what the next 15 or 20 years might look like when we're investing in transportation options. And I'll let Alex go into kind of some of the key takeaways and why it's going to be important over the next coming years.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce. Road usage charge, again, is like an idea that can sound kind of new, but is actually pretty well established both here in the United States and internationally. I've read that New Zealand, for example, has been collecting road usage charge since the 70s. And there are multiple states, in fact, the majority of states in the in America are either implementing some pilot version of a per mile charge policy or are studying it. Washington just completed a pilot study as well. One thing I think that's important to really keep in mind, and Bryce did a great job of explaining what this is like why it matters. So passed in the late 1940s, and what it does is it means that that pool of money can only be used on highway purposes. So we have put behind a giant wall the single largest source of transportation funding, and we cannot use it by constitutional mandate for the things that we our communities need and people overwhelmingly want, which is multimodal solutions. So and is the firm and strongly held belief of this organization that a road usage charge that gets implemented has to achieve several things, right? It needs to be equitable, it needs to be efficient, it needs to have all of those things. But importantly, it cannot be encumbered by the 18th Amendment. What we're talking about here is basically the infinite future of transportation spending in our state. And it is vitally important that we are able to build a 21st century transportation system, which we cannot do if this tool is locked away for highway purposes only.
And Alex, I think you might have gone on mute, and maybe you said this, and perhaps it was my internet connection too. But how could this, let me see how to ask this. How can you ensure, or how can legislators ensure that it's not locked away by the 18th Amendment requirement that it go to roads, or that the gas tax go to roads?
The passage of legislation that establishes road usage charge would have to be explicit about that.
Okay, great.
And I should add, I spent a lot of time at Puget Sound Regional Council, where we're doing the metropolitan planning for our region. The municipalities and the counties in there, which is the vast majority of the population of our state, is planning for and assuming that that money is free to spend on multimodal spending. So it is not possible for us to even come close to achieving our VMT reduction, our GHG reduction, safety, equity, any of those things, if that money is locked away in that way.
Senator Valdez, can you talk a little bit about what some of the issues and challenges are with the gas tax as it's currently set up?
Yes, okay, I'm muted. Can you hear me? Great, good. Thanks, Erica. So both Bryce and Alex kind of talked about in terms of where our transportation revenue comes from. I believe it's about 45 to 46%, give or take, right around there. Maybe some of these can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's close. Of our revenue, comes from the gas tax. Again, quite a significant portion, almost a half of it, is attributed to that. Of course, the other parts of the budget of the revenue that comes from our transportation comes from diesel taxes, permits and licenses, toll revenue, ferry fares, etc. But obviously, with the rise and the gradual rise of folks using electric cars, the pandemic, obviously people were driving less, and we saw a significant reduction in the revenue that was collected, by the gas tax. And it's going to take several years in order for that, for the state to catch up on what we were historically receiving. But as Alex talked about, is that currently, we are limited with the 18th Amendment on what we can spend this funding on. And with a road usage charge of the RUC, we can then be very, I think, a little bit more clear that we do want to be spent on multimodal, on transit, on improvements. Again, more ways again to help a more equitable transportation system, rather than having just to build and build more roads, which I think our public has clearly stated that, of course, that preservation and maintenance is important, but really we should really not be trying to build more roads to the very least extent. So that's I think the biggest challenges is how do we now, in a post-COVID environment where gas tax revenue is way down, folks using more electric vehicles, how can we then ensure that we are raising enough revenue to pay for the services that we want, but then also give us that flexibility to allow for, make it very clear that multimodal purposes, and again, especially with transit, more bus service is really what we need to be investing in.
And Senator Elias, you have the last word. What's the most critical thing to get right with this road usage charge legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we need to sort of center ourselves that we have today a road usage charge. The gas tax is paid as you drive. Now, we don't think about it that way because we pay it at the pump when we fill up our tank, but it is the equivalent. If I drive 3 tanks a week because I drive a lot, then I'm paying more. If I spend 1 tank a month, then I'm paying less and I'm driving less. So it's not really that much of a paradigm shift. It's more, how are you paying it and at what point? And I think that's the piece we need to work on the most. As we've studied some of the other states that are doing work in the road usage charge space, I think it's important to give Washingtonians choices in how to pay. And there's been discussion about various ways. You could pay at the pump, you could pay with a GPS tracker, which is scary to some people. You could pay once a year by reporting your mileage. I'm hopeful that we can have a pretty flexible approach and have people have multiple choices for how they contribute. Now, some options are more accurate, and so maybe the rate would be lower for the ones where we get the better data. Ones that are prone to a little bit more error might cost the consumer a little bit more, something like that. But I want to make sure we're not forcing people into one particular reporting mechanism, because that's where we get the most angst, is sort of how do we collect the miles and how do we make sure that, for folks that are really concerned about privacy, that they would have multiple ways of doing it. And then there's also a core fairness issue today. Our EVs and plug-in hybrids pay a flat fee, where it's sort of irrespective of how much you drive. And we know today, because of ranges, that EVs are not traveling as far as our ICE cars on average yet. We've got some good models that are getting there, but the early ones aren't. So they're paying disproportionately more to use the system. That's not very fair. So this would help us, essentially ask EV drivers, plug-in hybrid drivers to pay equivalent to their use rather than overpay like we see right now. So it's a paradigm shift. I think starting with some sort of opt-in system, that's what Oregon and Utah have done, to build kind of more data on how it works, and sort of slowly easing our way into this, giving a lot of choices to people for how to participate. Those to me are the hallmarks of how we successfully implement. And we do need bipartisan support. If we're going to replace the gas tax, we really need this to be something that has broad buy-in. So I think that speaks to a more phased implementation that is more cautious, and that we collect a lot more data as we do it, so that people feel comfortable that the system is fair and being equally applied across the state.
Great. All right. A question about traffic safety. We know that traffic deaths on the state's roads are way too high. What other safety bills or ideas are going to be coming up this session, and how can we support compliance without further entrenching our enforcement and carceral system? And I'm going to start again with you, Senator Elias.
Yeah, I think the data are alarming about the number of fatalities. We're on track. Unfortunately, hopefully the next 2 weeks are really, really safe, but assuming we stay on the trend, we could see over 700 Washingtonians lose their lives this year in crashes on our highways and streets, which would be the same level a level we haven't seen since 1996. I was a sophomore in high school back then. So, almost a 30-year high, which is not the direction we want to be headed. So I think we got to look at a variety of things. We've got to look at what the data shows us has maximum impact. We do need to have this conversation around enforcement. Like, the reason we have law enforcement is to protect our health and safety. And this is one of those core areas where aggressive driving under the influence, these are killing people. And so I don't want to spend our enforcement dollars on people innocently crossing the street in safe ways. I do want to spend our enforcement dollars making sure that people aren't dying needlessly on our highways. So I think it does speak to the core mission of what we need to be involved in state government, which is protecting health and safety. And I think we've got to focus in on the behaviors that are causing the most challenge while we build a safe system. We know, though, that safe system is going to take a while to build because a lot of our infrastructure is outdated and we can't get it all replaced in the next year. So we need a blend of a safe system vision with enforcement in ways that is data driven. So things that the data show have an impact are the blood alcohol content limit. Utah lowered theirs and they saw a 25% reduction in fatalities. We know that driver's ed matters. Our State Department of Licensing has said that young drivers who take driver's ed are 50% less likely to be involved in collisions than those who didn't. So we need to follow the data. And if there are measures that have a measurable impact on crashes and fatalities, we need to take a look at those, even if they sort of prompt tough questions. And then the equity considerations have to be a part of the dialogue. So if we're going to mandate more driver's ed, we need to make sure that it's more available at lower cost or no cost to folks who can't afford it. So it's not, we shouldn't do it because people can't afford it. It's, if people can't afford it, how do we make sure that this important educational model that reduces fatalities is available to everybody without income being a barrier? So I think the equity lens is about how do we achieve it, and then we should follow the data on what are the best approaches that can help us keep people safe out there.
Senator Valdez, same question for you. What other safety measures, ideas are you looking at this session to decrease road fatalities?
Yeah, thank you, Erica. Senator Leas did a wonderful job explaining all the issues there. At least I think for me, I'm going to be on the Senate side, the lone Seattle member on the Senate Transportation Committee, and we know that Seattle in particular, again, has seen an incredible alarming rise in the amount of traffic deaths with pedestrians and our bicyclists, and so much more to do. So, in the last session, I was able to work with Senator Carlisle and both Senator Leas and Chair Fye in the House on getting some funding for some improvements on Aurora to help with some of this. And we're hopeful that this can at least finally bring a much needed a decrease in pedestrian deaths there, and our bicyclists there, and that they feel safe. But we also know, but that was really more of the middle part of Aurora. We still have an issue up on the upper part of about 140th, 145th that also needs some drastic improvement. So I know I'll be looking hopefully to. Maybe I can lean on right now Senator Leas, Chair Leas, about helping me with some funding there again to help that Seattle shoreline area with improvements there. But again, we know that this is an alarming rate across not just Seattle but throughout all our state, and I think Senator Leas, Chair Leas said it very well regarding a driver's ed. But we also need to lower the cost of driver's ed and providing more resources so there are actually more classes being available and more instructors. We know that we've heard that there is a severe lack of that. So those are more investments we have to make there.
Just a quick question for both of you, maybe it's a yes or no. Is there going to be a blood alcohol content bill this year? Senator Leas, you mentioned that.
Yeah, it's already been pre-filed. Senator Lovick is sponsoring that in the Senate. I don't know in the House, but there certainly is a vehicle in the Senate that we'll be considering.
Okay, and then to turn it over to our TCC folks, Alex, could you talk a little bit about what TCC will be pushing for this year on the issue of traffic safety?
Yeah, I'm going to reference some work that our partners are really doing and leading on this that we're supporting. First, there is a whole kind of omnibus suite of reforms. I'm going to use the term safety here really broadly to talk about real safety that the ACLU of Washington is putting forward around traffic stops that get to that same kind of idea around using our limited enforcement resources on things that really affect safety. And so you're going to see an agenda being pushed there that is around non-moving offenses no longer being a primary offense. So that's an important one that is both about transportation justice as well as overall safety for folks with a really broad definition of what that means, as well as a whole suite of suggestions that are being advanced by Washington Bikes, our close partner, that includes things like no turn on red. We know that a huge proportion of crashes and fatalities are happening because of our free ride on red laws here. There's the blood alcohol. There are some suggestions that we're putting forward around things like asking that WashDOT come to the scene of incidences and do basically an engineering report that gets to some of the root causes of why crashes and fatalities are happening in certain places so that we can do real fixes, and a whole suite of ideas that really just are meant to recognize exactly how Senator Chairley has brought this up, which is that we are on track to just a tragic record here, number of fatalities on our roadways, and are really in no municipality or in the state on track to hit Vision Zero. And so we need to do something about it at the speed of the urgency that this crisis requires. I'll turn it to Bryce to add anything.
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that I want to add is first, the reference that both Senator Leas and Senator Valdez mentioned in terms of, the long-term goals of increasing safety through infrastructure design. A number of things that can occur before then, and a bill was passed last year on lowering certain speed limits without the written the approval of WashDOT in certain areas, which was great. And while directly lowering speed limits doesn't look like it's going to increase safety immediately, it does long-term changes to the planning for that corridor as well for safety purposes and infrastructure. And as Alex went through and talked about a couple others, one more I want to bring to mind to folks is a bill that won't go through transportation, but it's going to have a very big impact on local transportation planning. And that is a bill that updates the GMA climate, or updates the Growth Management Act to include climate. But the big changes that we're seeking on the bill this year that I know Representative Fye, who isn't here with us today, was in a meeting with myself, Alex, and the governor regarding what does level of service mean in local jurisdictions when we're talking about safety and traffics and long-term traffic planning. Right now, local jurisdictions, most of the level of service is what the throughput for vehicles is. If there's a delay in vehicle traffic, they have to widen the roadway to make sure more vehicles can go through. With an update to the climate bill that's coming back next year and is going to be a governor request bill, it's primed to refocus on safety, which would trigger a lot of new planning requirements and investments at the local level, where a lot of these fatalities happen with pedestrians being struck and others. So it's a big suite, as was mentioned, and I think we're going to tackle it from both a long-term funding, short-term enforcement, and understanding that hopefully over time we can design our streets so that enforcement is less and less necessary.
Just to that point, I want to add, I know we're talking about the future legislative session, but I want to just give a shout out to our chair and our senator-elect here to recognize the incredible amount of work towards road safety that is embedded within Move Ahead Washington legislation. The I say that, you know, the greatest legislative Easter egg of all time, the complete streets mandates for WashDOT as they do any project over $500,000 to bring that facility up to a complete street standard is a way to not just to really correct the mistakes that we've made in the past, as well as to set us on a course. So there is, you know, the things that we want to do and this session, but I want to just make sure that I really recognize the tremendous amount of work, both on the policy and of course on the investment side, to get to the real safety solutions that we need, which is infrastructure.
All right, so this is going to be a little bit of a lightning round because we've got about 4 minutes to keep on track. We want to get to some of those audience questions, but I do want to ask both senators, what other issues are going to be top priorities for you this session? And let's start with Senator Elias.
Yeah, I appreciate Bryce bringing up sort of land use, transportation, transit-oriented development is going to be a priority for me. We've made massive investments in public transit and move ahead, and we want to make sure that people can live near them and affordably move around our communities. Alex has educated me that it's $10,000 a year to own and operate a car in the Puget Sound per year, which is a tremendous cost for low-income Washingtonians and for many others. So to the extent we can build more housing of all types near transit, it means that people don't need a car or don't need multiple cars or can make different choices. So that's going to be one. And because I know we love breaking news on Publicola sponsored events, I just heard that Rick Larson has been.
I just want to correct you there. TCC is sponsoring. I'm just the moderator.
All right. Well, Publicola smiled upon events. Congressman Rick Larson has just been recommended as the Democratic lead on the House Transportation Committee. So Washington's transportation dominance hopefully will continue at the federal level as well. But yes, transportation-oriented development, another priority for me, as well as, you know, a whole host of non-transportation things I care about, like civil rights and, you know, other good things.
Senator Valdez.
Thanks, Erica. I think on the transportation side, I mentioned earlier, I think trying to find some more funds to help with the safety improvements that are so badly needed on Aurora Avenue is a top priority for me. Also, for those of you who may not know, the Washington State Patrol jurisdiction also is underneath the transportation committees. And I've been working for the last several years very diligently about finally holding our State Patrol accountable that its workforce reflect the diversity of our state. It's been a challenge, but our State Patrol workforce, unfortunately, is still very male and very white, not just in the rank and file troopers, but also in their upper administration. We were able to pass a bill last year with the support of both Chair Elias and Chair Fye. I want to thank them both publicly for that, for supporting me on these efforts. And we're hopeful to see some recommendations coming up here for 2023 on what the state can do to become a little bit more, again, reflective of its diversity of its state. On non-transportation issues, I think my big one for me, of course, is my work on gun safety. We finally last year got the high capacity magazine ban bill. I partnered with Senator Elias here, and we were able together finally get that across the finish line. Took many years of work, but now it's time on to the next step, which is to ban assault weapons in our state. So looking forward to rolling up my sleeves and hopefully getting that done this year. Again, there's many other things I can talk about, but I think in the last 15 minutes, let's just try to get through some other questions.
All right, last question for the panel. How can people get involved this session and advocate for these issues? And I'm going to throw that out to whoever wants to grab that one.
I want to grab that one. You can sign up to stay in touch with Transportation Choices Coalition. Like, we send out newsletters and emails all the time that talk about our priorities and important things that are happening in transportation. I talked about becoming an endorsement and joining our broad coalition around jaywalking. We have some pretty cool spaces that we convene on a weekly basis. The Washington Transportation Advocates Call, where we send out, we have a big call and talk about what's happening in the legislature, as well as every kind of level around transportation in Washington and the federal government. And there's excellent notes that get sent out to that. So you can always reach out to TCC and become part of our really broad coalition of people who care about this stuff, and we'll be more than happy to provide you with opportunities to share your stories, get involved, send letters, do testimony, all of the things that really, really matter in bringing partnership and power to these policy priorities.
Yeah, I would agree. I would also shout out WA Bikes through the and Cascade Bicycle Club in partnership. That two of them are great partner organizations, or however they're structured. The other thing I would say, because Alex is being very shy and demure, is TCC is not a for-profit company. They do rely on support from people that are like-minded. So consider being a sustaining supporter of TCC as well, so that they can keep doing all this amazing organizing year in and year out.
All right. So we're going to go to audience questions. We've received a lot of questions from all of you at registration and in the chat during this conversation. And I'm going to start with the most commonly asked questions, and we'll get through as many as we can. So the first question actually goes back to the road usage charge. What is the expected impact of the RUC on rural populations and low-income people? And how might we make it more progressive and valuable across the state?
I think it's an open question. We know that lower income folks are more likely to drive older model vehicles, which are typically less efficient in terms of gas usage. So there's a model where it could actually help even that out by having folks pay per use. In terms of rural populations, I think that's why we want to sort of have a slow implementation and some folks opting into it to collect more data and really understand all of the various disaggregated impacts. I think depending on how you structure it and how you structure pricing, it can either correct for some of these things, or it can double down on existing disparities. That's a lot of what the early pilots have been focused on. I think as we move into implementation, making sure that it is equitable will be a lens, and how we do that remains an open question that I think we'll continue to iterate on as we move forward.
All of that, and I'll just bring it back to and it also really matters how we spend that money, right? Like the reality is that the vast majority of Washingtonians are in forced car dependency, and it is the priority of the senators here and TCC to provide more options. So how we use that money is also very important in terms of giving people real alternatives, especially people who have been economically displaced into places that require auto usage and the associated costs that come with it.
And some folks are asking in the chat, or I'm seeing a couple of questions about charging by weight. Is that anything that has come up in discussions about the RUC so far? Like charging more for heavier vehicles, which would probably—
It is not. We do already assess a vehicle weight fee as part of your annual car tabs. So that's one of the charges that people pay already. It's also just a good reminder that, our taxation system tries to balance all these equities, but it's going to be hard to design a system that perfectly addresses each element. And so we try and sort of get what is generally fair and generally equitable, recognizing that you can always find kind of like some outlier case where it doesn't work perfectly. So I think the existing weight fee probably for the time being covers that piece, and it won't be as much of a consideration. Also remember that we've got the Clean Fuel Standard and the Climate Commitment Act that will generally over time have an impact on gas prices. So the carbon intensivity of our fuel will hopefully decline as the Clean Fuel Standard does its job. So we don't have to solve everything in each of these. We just need to make sure they interrelate in ways that lead to good outcomes and not continue to disproportionately impact marginalized communities.
Another audience question, how will you, and I think this is for the legislators, how will you support funding for our existing regional rail program? Will the legislature fund next projects in the long range plan for Amtrak Cascades? And has Washington State applied for federal grants to improve Amtrak infrastructure?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a quick answer for that, Erica. I know I have definitely one thing that I think that we were not able to cover in the transportation package that passed last year was further investments in our traditional rail and especially in Amtrak. I know I've heard over the last few months from advocates, especially in my district, about the importance of this, and of course it's a very popular route. We made a significant investment in an ultra high speed rail, which was a big priority for our governor. But we missed out on traditional rail, and so at least in this upcoming session, I have will be at least trying to see what investments we can make and see about again improving those routes. I mean, it's a very popular route, as I said. People enjoy it, people like it, and I think it's one thing that we still need to preserve here in our transportation system.
Yeah, and I will just say, I agree. I love trains of all kinds, whether they are light, medium, or heavy. We want lots of trains, more trains of all kinds, preferably all electric as we move forward. The department has applied for federal funds for Amtrak Cascades, and in fact received an award while we were in session last year. We're going to receive, which I love this word, train sets, which means the equipment, the trains themselves, they call them train sets, which takes me back to like elementary school. But we're going to receive some free train sets from the federal government here in the next couple of years, which will help take that cost off of the state as we move forward. The other piece that we're really focused on is getting Amtrak Cascades back up to its level of service. Its ridership remains really severely impacted post-pandemic. They're not offering the level of service that they did before. So we're working together with the WashDOT to get them up and running as quickly as possible. And we did, I agree and mostly with my senator-elect colleague, but we did include Amtrak Cascades and Kids Ride Free. So young people will be able to use Amtrak Cascades for free at some point in 2023 once that's fully implemented. We need to do a lot more than that, but we did a teeny bit to help spur some more usage of rail. And I think of it as a down payment with a lot more to come.
There's another question about some studies that the legislature asked for that deal with transit and transportation equity. For example, the transportation equity in cities study, the non-driver study, and the frequent transit service study. How does the legislature anticipate using those findings, and what are the next steps for implementing the best recommendations or findings that come out of those studies?
I think the frequent transit service and the one focused on kind of our non-drivers, which is not my favorite frame, because I think we should define people by what we like that they do, not like what they don't do. So we're still working on that. But I think both of those, what was clear out of the early work is that there's more work to be done to further understand the needs and future investments. So this gives us kind of like step one around where is frequent transit service, where is it planned? I think we need more work and likely some follow-on study to better define like what's the investment strategy to do more in more places. Similarly with the walkers and rollers study, it gave us some early information on who comprises our non-driving populations, but I think we're going to need more work on sort of better understanding and disaggregating. What we learned is it's a very diverse group of Washingtonians, so there's not like one set of needs. There's people with disabilities, there's elders, there's young people, and so there's rural versus urban folks. So understanding the disproportionate or the disaggregated needs of that community, if it's even one community. I mean, it's really more like a distinct group of people or a disparate group of people that I think we need to do some more work on. So there isn't like okay, this is the one thing that all non-driving people need. It's like if you're a Indigenous person in a rural community, here's what you may need. If you're a person with a disability in downtown Seattle, here's what you might need. And so how do we sort of start to group that in ways that we can invest more strategically is probably the next step for that study. The urban mobility or the urban equity one, I am not as familiar with, so I can't speak to that, but maybe I don't know if Senator-elect Valdez followed that work more.
Yeah, I'm probably not also in the best position to answer it, but I'd have to see what the report was. It doesn't ring a bell to me, so I'd have to read up on it.
So we've got about 2 minutes left, so I'm gonna combine a couple questions really fast. One questioner asked about infrastructure for biking. What are you planning along those lines? And then a secondary question is, after passing the monumental transportation package last year, is there a challenge getting colleagues to prioritize transit and transportation this session? And I guess we'll start with Senator Valdez, since you are on.
Yeah, I mean, with the package, 30% of that, last year went to multimodal, but then we also had more investments in our bike ped infrastructure and bike ped safety. So again, to me, that's just the down, it's the down payment. We know we still need more. And so I'm hopeful that we can build upon that as well. The second question about is getting support from rural, I think on transit. Is that
getting support in the legislature this year, since there was such a big package that passed last year?
Sure.
Is there still momentum?
I mean, I think maybe Senator Chair Elias may have a more robust answer in terms of working, as his role as chair. But I think the challenges that we had a lot with that is that, of course, certain legislators may not be a fan of it, but they're on those areas, but their constituents and their transit operators and those agencies are clamoring for it. So there seems, again, there's always that disconnect between what the local transit agencies need and their the support they have, but yet their own elected officials sometimes they don't seem to always agree. And so I think that's always a challenge that we're facing.
Senator Elias?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, we passed Move Ahead, but getting those dollars out the door and on the ground takes time. And so that's our focus is going to be on how quickly can we get resources to agencies to build improvements. Kids Ride Free was actually kind of lightning speed for government. And we want to sort of build on that and get these improvements done faster so that we see, real life improving for our communities more quickly. But I think that'll be our focus this year is like, we approved $3 billion, let's get it out the door, let's get it on the ground, let's see the impacts, and beginning the medium-term conversation on how do we get even more as we continue to move forward.
All right, well, we are almost at time. So I want to thank you all so much for your insights and perspectives on these issues. The legislative session begins on January 9th. To stay updated with transportation choice, link that is being dropped in the chat, and be on the lookout for ways to get involved with TCC during the session, including a week of action that will begin on January 30th. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.